Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It's your local community radio station. My name's Andy, broadcasting on Jagera and Turrbal country. And today on the show, we are going to be talking about a topic that has been certainly in people's minds recently and in the media quite a bit. It is violence against women. This year, we've seen shockingly high rates of murders, in particular women murdered by their domestic partner in Australia. Although it should be noted that every year, actually, that is shockingly high, and that the numbers this year, I think we're in the 30s this year so far, women who have been killed by men, murdered. But that's about average for most years in Australia, at least. But of course, we're less than halfway through. This year is one of the real worries. But certainly, as well, there's a lot more. Murder is one extreme end of the spectrum of domestic violence in this country, and it's quite difficult. Even you have to be quite mentally unwell, really, to kill another human being most of the time, and also not that many people can really do it. But domestic violence happens on a much, much larger scale than that, and that's what should be remembered when these conversations about the really sensational ones hit the media, is that actually abusive relationships and use of coercion and force in relationships is much, much more common than any number that they will ever report, because even, you know, it's never being written down anywhere. Nobody's being charged, nothing's been reported, anything like that. And so this is a serious issue, a really, really serious issue. You have to look at it and say something is very, very wrong if this is how our romantic relationships are going, or something, that we're doing something very wrong. And so today we're going to interrogate a bit about that. What is it that maybe has led to this? I'm going to play an interview I did with Jess Hill, who is a journalist and a writer. She wrote a book called See What You Made Me Do back in 2020. That was the occasion of me doing this interview. I'm going to replay it. I had to listen to it again just this morning, and I think there's lots of worthwhile things, and it's good to be able to delve into it over the course of a long-form interview and talk about, you know, beyond just the simple kind of answers or the simple like shock value of these incidents, to talk about why does this happen and what can we do about it. And so that is what's coming up. I guess, yeah, I should give a warning if this is something that is likely to make you feel distressed or anything like that. For the next hour, we are going to be talking about violence against women, and so you may want to tune out and take it easy and do whatever it is that can calm you down if that is necessary for you. But for the rest of us, I think, yeah, it is a truly significant issue, and particularly for those of us like me who are a man, because it's an inescapable fact that the majority of these incidents are being perpetuated by men. And no, not all of us are doing it, but we do have to ask the question, what is it about being a man in Australia in 2024 that means so many people are doing this? And it's some big question. And what is it that men can do about it, you know, to talk to each other and things like that? And so we do talk a little bit about that with Jess Hill, of course, who is not a man, but who has spent such a large portion of her life to researching these things and publishing them and things like that. And so some of us fellas, maybe it's worth us considering how we can do some of the work and lessen the burden on women who have taken this on. And yeah, we are living in an age where domestic violence, you would think that it would be on the improve after years of public awareness campaigns and things like that. But I think where the level of alienation that we're experiencing in society at the moment means that kind of mental illness and violent responses and things like that seem to be something on the increase, and so this is only going to be an issue that we need to deal with more. But anyway, let's get into it and have a listen to Jess Hill.
My name's Jess Hill. I'm the author of See What You Made Me Do and otherwise a journalist.
You have done over the years a lot of journalism about domestic abuse against women, and See What You Made Me Do is the latest and longest example. Can you tell us a bit about the book?
Yeah, so the book, the book started really as a way to explore what happens to women, especially in abusive relationships, and how it feels to go through it, what it looks like, and why they make the choices they do. And then it expanded far out beyond that original remit, and it became a lot more about why do men particularly do it, but also what happens when men and women, on both victim and perpetrator, are interacting with justice system. What happens to children? What are we seeing in First Nations communities? And then how are we actually going to go about fixing this? And so, throughout the book, the first few chapters are probably a bit heavy going. There's not a lot of light at those tunnels. But really, from about halfway through, we're talking about, well, if this is a problem, what's the solution?
Your book did win the Stella Prize for female authors in Australia, and one of the judges, Louise Swin, said that the book dismantles all the lazy old lies we associate with domestic violence. What are some of those lazy ideas?
Well, one of the lazy ideas I had to dismantle for myself was the idea that, women commonly make up allegations of abuse to get an advantage in the family law courts. Things that, the family courts are biased towards mothers. Ideas, it's even not lazy old ideas, but lazy old frames. The fact that every time we hear about a relationship that's gone on for years where there's been domestic violence, the first thing you think is, why did she stay so long? Instead of, why does he continue to do it, and why wouldn't he let her leave? So it was like about, a lot of the time it was about flipping rather than sort of dispelling a lie or even myth-busting, although there is quite a bit of that. It's more about flipping the framework and go, why haven't you asked this question? Why hasn't the perpetrator been front and centre of your frame when you've been thinking about this issue? Why has it always been the victim's choices that you've interrogated? And why haven't you sat down and thought about what the perpetrator may have done to move the victim towards certain choices? So that was really, and a lot of it, I really don't write the book from a position of, you haven't been trying hard enough, or you're all prejudiced, or, you've got horrible stereotypes. I'm writing the book from a position of, I've had these stereotypes. I into domestic violence in 2015 as a reporter, having had no experience with it, personally or professionally, and I had to upend a whole bunch of my own sort of old ideas and just naive notions. So I think part of the reason the book took so long, there's lots of reasons, but part of the reason was I was really determined to interrogate my biases and turn them inside out and upside down and wonder where they came from, so that I could get closer to the reader and be there alongside the reader instead of just sort of wagging my finger at them.
Yeah, that's been one of the things that's been emphasised about the book, is that you try to flip the view from asking questions about survivors or victims to asking about perpetrators and why they do. But is there a balance there to wanting to empower survivors to take action that can, help themselves and prevent things, and trying to, at the same time, look at perpetrators, why they do it, and try to stop it on that end?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, my thing wasn't that I wasn't sort of cross with the reader for asking those questions about victims. I wanted to show them, first up, that here's why. Here's why they may not leave. Here's why they may not even realise it's abuse. And now we've got that sorted, let's move on. And I guess, in terms of, laying out sort of options for people who are in abusive relationships, and not just saying, well, they can't leave because it's too dangerous, or they can't leave because the perpetrator does X, Y, Z. It's to really show people who are in abusive relationships and the people who love them as friends and family what sort of mental processes happen as a result of domestic abuse. So the kinds of rationalisations that victims will make that will cover up for themselves that the abuse is going on. So things like there's 6 really common rationalisations. I won't read them all, but just off the top of my head, a really strong one is I can fix him. I'm the strong one in the relationship, and this man is badly damaged. I will be the strong and loving person in his life who will turn this around. I mean, that goes for male victims of domestic abuse as well. They often have the same response to a woman who's being abusive, or may have substance abuse issues. Other responses can be, look, it's not really them. It's the fact that they lost their job, or they've got this mental illness, or they've got this drug addiction, and as soon as we get that sorted, their behaviour will change. Or it might be, I got married, I made that decision, and marriage and family is absolutely the number one thing in my life, and I will not do anything to upend that. Like, divorce is just an impossibility. So, and that might be cultural, it might be religious, it might just be a personal value. It might be the fact that they grew up in a broken home and they never want to give that to their children. So they'll kind of cover up the abuse in their mind, because the idea of breaking up with that partner and losing a father for their children is just so incomprehensible that you sort of have to rationalise what's going on to make it okay that you're staying. So there's a lot of doublethink that goes on for victims of domestic abuse. And I think that by showing them what that doublethink is, helps them to just reassess where they're at and whether they're making the right choices, or just give them some consciousness around it. But most of all, building their confidence, because essentially domestic abuse is a crime of humiliation. Humiliation is absolutely at the centre, degradation, the overriding of someone's autonomy. So the best thing you can do for someone going through that is not to tell them what they should do, or try to make them feel bad for not making the right choices. The best thing to do is build their confidence and build their self-esteem so they feel empowered to make choices that will be best for themselves, instead of just always thinking about what their partner needs or wants.
One of the things that has been talked about before, anytime there's a higher profile case of domestic abuse or murder or something like that, there's this line of, not all men are like this, that it's an individual issue of certain damaged men that do this. But most people looking at it with a kind of wider angle lens across our society say, well, there's something systemic about this that makes this. What are the things that do you think that make this a systemic issue?
Oh gosh, there's so much. I think that at the heart of it, you're looking at issues around patriarchal masculinity. The fact that, a lot of guys, unfortunately, in intimate relationships, can find it very hard to be really closely emotionally connected. And part of the reason for that is that from the time that they're pretty young, there's a great family therapist in the States who says that around 4 or 5, his name's Terence Real, says around 4 or 5, boys go through what he calls just this normal traumatization process, where the soft side of them, or a side of them that may be perceived as girly or feminine, is kind of shamed out of them. If not by parents, by friends, other family members. It's not even necessarily malicious. Sometimes it's just, he gives the example of his son coming, he loves to dress up as the good witch. And, at one stage he comes to the top of his stairs of his family home, and he's dressed in this full regalia. He's about 5. And his bigger brother is down the bottom of the stairs with all his friends. And they look up the stairs, and this little boy, Alexander, is ready to, flounce down the stairs, so proud and so in his character. And the little boys don't say a word. They don't call him any names, but they just look at him with this, it's this look of shame. It's like, you can't do that. And the message is so clear that Alexander just turns on his heel, runs to his room, throws off his outfit, and then, runs downstairs, and they go downstairs and, make swords and shields and all the rest of it, and he never dresses up again. And, those moments, we don't sort of rate those moments as traumatic moments, but what they are is they're instructional moments. And so many little boys go through this, where it's like, you can't be soft, you can't be girly, and then what is girly? Oh, girly is being open and vulnerable and all those things. So over time, you're getting this, basically we're training a lot of young boys and into men who find it very hard to be open and vulnerable and emotional in relationships. Now, if you combine that with either really strong sort of gendered stereotypes about what men should or shouldn't get in relationships, if you combine it with other childhood traumas, if you combine it with a deep-seated sense of shame, where someone is, and someone's absolutely terrified of being abandoned or left by their partner, or if you combine it with, really strong narcissism and entitlement, you can get men who are in other parts of their lives may seem A, functional, B, totally lovely people, but in the intimate space, they get triggered into this completely sort of, Mr. Hyde type personality, such that they're in one state, in that intimate space, they are such a different person that people don't even believe they're capable of doing what they are doing. So when people say not all men, well, of course, lots of men will take that training that they get and they will either resist, or they'll just sort of be a bit cut off in relationship, but not violent or abusive. But you have enough men for whom there are no warning signs to their friends and family, being sadistic in their relationships and even ending up killing their partners and their children. And when people say not all men, it's like, yeah, but which men are not? Because actually when I go to the courts and when I talk to people who've been through these relationships, I can't pick which guys would or wouldn't be like that. And that's the point, is that, maybe not all men, but which men are not, which men are definitely not. And that's what's really confronting when you start looking at this, is that the possibility of violence, the potential for violence, for control, etc., lives in so many men. And it's scary for a lot of men who find themselves in that position. Some guys will call the men's referral service or go to counselling or whatever, absolutely terrified of what they are discovering in themselves. So, that's what I think the not all men thing, it's not just about sort of covering that up and, about not keeping women safe. But I want men to really start confronting this in themselves so that they can, A, have better lives, and B, not end up ruining not only their partners and their children's lives, but their own lives.
Yeah, in terms of how to approach this and try to fix some of these issues, do you think that there's a balance there, that some things are trying to change systemic things society-wide, and then there are some things that individual men need to do? I mean, whether they are somebody who has abused a partner or not, are there individual responsibilities to take on this issue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of like, so for me, I look back on the last 40 or 50 years of feminism, right? So let's say since the second wave in the 70s. And women have undergone this process of relearning what it is to be a woman in the modern world, right? And, what it is not to just, live in your house and in your housework, and to actually have ambition, and to have a life independent of your family. That's those sorts of things. That was something. They were really hard lessons for women to learn, and there was a lot of personal sacrifice involved in, and women being ostracised from their families in trying to define themselves in the modern world. And men, unfortunately, in the last 50 years, have done a lot less of that. It's sort of like, I think when the Me Too movement came along, it butted up against a masculinity that basically hadn't developed, in 50 years, with only bits and pieces that might have changed, a bit more involvement in parenting, a bit more involvement in the housework, but fundamentally unreformed. And so I think what men need to do now is to really take it upon themselves to modernise. And part of that includes, like, hey, read my book, but not my book, but, read feminist authors who speak to men. Read people like Bell Hooks, get a sense of the system that we're living in, get a sense of the messages that you are being steeped in as a boy and now as a man, and start to think about, what do you identify with? What works for you? What doesn't work for you? Who are you? Start to really re-identify with yourself as an individual with feelings, with an internal world, not just as someone who's out there trying to make it, or, trying to do right by the family, all the shoulds that men have, or I should be this successful by this age, or I should have the car, I should have the wife, I should have whatever. It's like, who are you? I think a lot of men kind of stop really developing that internal part of themselves because it's like all externalized, just got to focus on what you can achieve. And it's meant that I think now a lot of women are expecting a lot more from men in relationship, a lot closer intimacy, a lot greater emotional development. And I think a lot of men just feel like they're really unable to provide that because they weren't brought up like that. So it is a really big journey for men to go on now. And unfortunately, in the face of a culture that's quite angry with men for not already having done that. So it can be very confronting for a lot of guys and they can feel quite confused. But yeah, there is work to do. We've all got work to do. I think a lot of women, I know myself, I have work to do in allowing my partner to be more vulnerable and more open, and they're not feeling annoyed by that, or not feeling like, I just want him to attend to my problems. I want him to be the strong man, There's lots of stuff that both men and women have to do, but men are doing a bigger catch-up game.
You mentioned the Me Too movement. A lot was made of it in the media, particularly, I guess, because it's quite high-profile celebrities often that were either being called out or telling their stories. Do you think that for the average woman in a domestic abuse situation, has the media coverage of this changed the situation?
Look, I think the media has changed enormously even in the last 5 years. I think there's still bad reporting that goes on, no question, but people are right onto it now. Like if you get some insensitive reporting to a domestic homicide, for example, social media will be all over that report in a matter of minutes. And journalists and newspapers and broadcasters are being shamed for that, and rightly so. I think that there's a lot more journalists who spend a lot more time trying to understand domestic abuse and reporting on it more sensitively. There's still a lot more to do in terms of understanding what the effect is on the victims and what domestic abuse actually looks like. And that's not just from the reporting side, that's from the justice system side, from policing. It's why I really try to put forward the idea that physical violence is only one component of domestic abuse, and it may not even be a component in some relationships, that really humiliation and control is the central locus point of a lot of this abuse. So we sort of, because the law does this, we put physical violence really at the pointy end of domestic abuse, and we sort of judge how severe a domestic abuse is by the severity of the physical violence. Whereas that's actually often not the victim's experience. The severity of the abuse for them is based on lots of other different elements. Isolation, whether they've been tracked and monitored through their phone or their car, through GPS systems or on spyware. things like how tightly have they been controlled? What was the level of degradation? You know, that's the stuff that victims talk about first up when you first talk to them. And often the physical violence they'll tell you about later, but it's not the most important thing to them. So we kind of got it upside down. And I guess the biggest thing I'm trying to do with the book really is to flip that pyramid. It's not so that physical violence is down the bottom, but just so that it's not up the top, so that we start thinking about the effect on the self-esteem and the dignity of the person before we just think about the effect on their flesh. So things like that, I think, that's where we've got a while to go. But I think that we're basically, Me Too has really given a lot of victims their dignity back, and it's made people much more interested in hearing women's stories and not just wanting to exile them as inconvenient. It hasn't 100% fixed that, because you still see women who bring up these situations, especially in corporate workplaces or in Hollywood, essentially sort of being exiled from those environments. But generally speaking, the public wants to know. So there's a lot of work to do. But Me Too has been an absolutely seismic shift. And even if we don't see a bunch of sexual harassers in jail, what we have seen is just a total restart of a totally new kind of feminism that is good for men and for women.
There's something you touched on it there. I guess the sensationalism of the dramatic violent murder or something means that it gets a lot of media coverage. And in recent years, we've seen, say, Jill Maher in Melbourne, or Rosie Batty, her son murdered, or even like Elliot Rogers, the mass shooting at the university in the US. These get a lot of media coverage, and they are sort of flashpoints for a feminist movement against domestic violence. But they make domestic abuse out to be this very dramatic, one-off violent thing, rather than those everyday controlling behaviours, don't they?
Yeah, I guess what we're starting to do, and I think Jill Maher, that was the first, or one of the first times that you really saw like the nation coming together around the murder of a woman, just in recent times. Not the first time ever, but just it was like this galvanizing moment, and something moved, and the media sort of kept on reporting on it. It felt like there was just a cultural movement that was sort of starting to brew. Not for the first time in history, but sort of the first time in more recent history. Then with the murder of Luke Batty, that was just so shocking, the idea that would happen in public, but then that Rosie would just front up and be so articulate. And, as I say in the book, she also happened to be from what I call the demilitarized zone of the white middle class. So she was kind of that classic, like, every woman, and because she kept on fronting up to the media and just took on that mantle of campaigner right from the very get-go, it took a moment and it just magnified it. And what that means is, so when you have these major flashpoints, as you called them, most recently the murder of Hannah Clark and her 3 children, what it means is people are paying attention, and it's like, what do you do with that attention? And with Hannah Clark, it was really about explaining, well, what is coercive control? Because the point with Hannah was that she didn't think it was abuse because he'd never used physical violence against her. But everything that had happened to her in her relationship, the isolation, the coercion, it was just tick, 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 all of the classic behaviours of a coercive controller and a domestic abuser. And yet she didn't know, because she, in her mind, pictured domestic violence as physical violence only. So that's what the media has really picked up and run with, to say, like, this is a teachable moment. Like, we need to get across to people that these are the big red flags that you need to be aware of in your own relationships or in your friends' relationships. And even though these horrific murders, yes, they do make it out to look like domestic abuse is this just really dramatic event or incident, but actually sometimes you do need that just to jolt the public out of a type of stupor and to really pay attention, and then you can get in front of them the more subtle, everyday, grey area stuff that so many people are living in.
Yeah, the media has really asked a lot of questions about how it reports it, how it talks about it, and you're right, this is an ongoing thing. I'm interested in, beyond just reporting domestic violence cases, is there something kind of deep-seated about the stories our society tells about, you know, romantic relationships or masculinity that continue to breed this beyond just, you know, when violence is talked about? How does the idea of romance get perverted so frequently in our society?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, there's been a lot said about how the Hollywoodization or the Disneyfication of romance around, you know, obsessive suitors who will not take no for an answer, who 1,000 times a day, you know, and that's all a sign of love, or who cannot stand anyone else looking at the one they love or the one they're attracted to. That's something that shows that, you know, that you are desired, instead of what actually, once you start to study domestic abuse, is just like big red flags. Like, it's not so much that, you know, that you can't have a situation where all of those things are present that doesn't end up being abusive and ends up just sort of settling down into a really positive relationship. But if I had a daughter and their partner couldn't stand them being around other men, and rang obsessively, I would be having a very stern word to him. But a lot of women really take that as like, oh my God, he's so interested in me, and he just, you know, you should see him when other men are around. He just cannot, you know, he can't stand anyone looking at me. It can feel like you are the center of the universe for that person, and that's really appealing. And also remembering that, like, we sort of want to be wrapped up, and we weren't like falling in love with someone. We want to be wrapped up in that world. There's something appealing anyway, aside from the stories that we tell, but we don't, I guess, really tell young women especially how healthy relationships form and how you can manage those really strong feelings but still give each other space and respect and freedom, you know, to be two individuals in a relationship instead of being subsumed into it so completely in a way that can end up then being unhealthy and you know, in the worst cases, abusive.
Yeah, when it comes to movies or love songs or whatever, that kind of, you know, moderate respect for somebody else's autonomy doesn't have the same emotional impact of the obsessive love, does it?
No, that's right.
Another cultural thing that is widespread in our society and that has been commonly linked to domestic violence is addictions, alcohol addiction, gambling addiction.
Yeah.
Are these things that are told often enough as part of the narrative, and particularly when it comes to talking about how do we address the issue, you know, is this something that is taken enough into consideration? I
think, no, it's not. It's not taken enough into consideration. You know, my partner was a problem gambling counsellor for a long time. And federal government. You know, the fact is, what you see in all of these problems like addiction or whatever, is you see pain that needs to go somewhere, that needs either to be distracted from, or it needs to, or there's frustration, there's a feeling of not being able to be with yourself. And so you go off and you take heroin or you pump money into a pokey, whatever you do to try to transfer that pain. You know, my partner can explain a lot better than I can, but essentially it's the same stuff, you know. And yes, we have a lot of, like, you know, you see a lot of problem gambling as a problem with perpetrators. You see a lot of porn addiction. You certainly see substance abuse. And I guess what the domestic violence sector has always sort of tried to emphasise is that a lot of the time it's not that these things are causing the violence, it's that they are coexisting with it. But they're all symptoms of the same problem, which is a basic, like, you know, essentially a lack of true self-love. And I'm not talking about sort of narcissistic self-love where a guy thinks he's an undiscovered hero and is really grandiose. you look at someone like Donald Trump, who's perhaps the biggest narcissist on the planet, and, you see someone who keeps calling himself, the world's biggest genius, but actually is lacking any type of real self-love, and when you have people who are lacking self-love like that, they can become destructive to other people or to themselves. And so essentially that's what we're trying to deal with. Now, there are situations where someone goes into substance abuse, whether it be alcohol addiction, drug addiction, where they do become violent in a way that they weren't before. And when that addiction or the substance abuse is taken care of, the violence seems to subside. And so in those cases, there is a causal relationship, but a lot of the time you're just seeing a soup of problems. And by fixing one, you're not necessarily going to take care of the abuse. The abuse may be happening quite separately to that.
Okay, well, finally, I guess the million-dollar question is, we have a serious problem in our society with domestic abuse. Where do solutions come from at both a systemic government level or a grassroots private level? From your research, where do you think we need to start on fixing this problem?
Well, look, I think we need to start by just shoring up the safety net for women when they leave. And that can be, really developing good programs for men. It can be about ensuring that men can be ousted from the home and then accommodated elsewhere where they're not just going to be roaming the streets, brewing and getting more and more angry. It can be about making sure that the refuge system is fully funded so that women are not being put in hotels in the first instance or put in boarding houses or unsafe accommodation. Obviously, the community legal centres that so often give women legal representation are dramatically underfunded. There's really basic things that are literally about dollars that need to be taken care of. And then there are more complex issues, like how do we actually start to go about addressing this? And what I've seen is really the system that works is where you get a community to really own the problem. And when I say community, it doesn't need to be small. It can be a city or it can be a smaller a town. But I've profiled both in the last chapter of the book. I look at a city of 100,000 and a town of 2,500 of Burke in New South Wales. And essentially what they did without knowing it, they both did essentially the same thing. And that was to reach out, basically, firstly, to really understand what was going on in their community, to get the data on who was doing what and when was it happening and where was it happening, and then to say, we're going to make perpetrators of domestic abuse visible. We are going to be watching you, and we're not just going to wait for your victims to come to us. We're going to really bring the community in to keep eyes on these people. But most importantly was to reach out to these perpetrators and say, we love and respect you and we want you to be a functioning part of our community. We will give you the help that you need in whatever way, whether it be about substance abuse or employment or whatever it is that you feel is going wrong in your life, or whether you need trauma or grief counselling or just support to change your behaviour. We'll be here. But if you don't change your behaviour, then we're now working together with the justice system, and our priority is facing domestic abuse. So if you don't change, the justice system is going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. And so, those strategies where you don't just bring in a justice system response, and you don't just bring in a rehabilitation response, but you do both. That's what seems to work, because in both Burke and in High Point, North Carolina, which is a city in the States, these responses that were fully community-owned, that had very close collaboration between the justice system and the community sectors, they saw massive reductions in domestic homicide. They saw huge reductions in re-victimization rates. And essentially, in High Point, North Carolina, they cut the domestic homicide rate by 2/3. And there was only, I think, in about 5 or 6 years, one homicide occurred with someone that they had been engaged with, and the rest were people either coming through town or that hadn't come above the radar. So what they've sort of figured is that this response works. So I sort of think, as much as we absolutely need government involved, communities do have to take this on, at the council level or at the broader city level, and really start to own it, because it's actually domestic abuse. It may seem like it's just this individual problem, but actually what it does is it filters out to so many areas of our community, to homelessness, to health, to drug and alcohol, to mental illness. All of that stuff is rotating and circulating around domestic abuse, and that's why, as a community, we need to confront it rather than just waiting for a federal government or a state government to take care of it for us.
Okay, thanks very much, Jess, for chatting with us today. And your book, See What You Made Me Do, is available for people to read?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Andy.
That is Jess Hill. Hope you have enjoyed today's show, although it's not the most lighthearted and fun topic, but I think a useful discussion, and certainly it is a significant issue that we're currently facing, and the shockwaves, I think, ring out when we live, especially with social media, I guess, constantly surrounded by these stories, news stories and things like that, and the nature of these media with all the updates means that so many people are living in this, and it's having so many effects on people even outside of those immediately affected by domestic violence. And the women, the 28 women this year that have been murdered by men, and it certainly is an issue that needs addressing. And I think there's not easy answers, not simple answers, and so Jess Hill certainly done a lot of work to try to find some answers, and I hope you found that conversation useful, and I'll see you next week.